Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is 7:30 on a Monday night. We are ready to roll Outsmarting Anti-Semitism, lesson number 3, entitled The Promised Land. You know, there's a Texan, guy from Dallas, visiting Israel, and he feels thirsty. He's on one of these guided tours and he feels thirsty. So he decides to stop at one of these little bodegas on the side of the road for a drink. And he goes in and he starts schmoozing with the owner. He buys, a cold bottle of water or whatever else. And he says to the owner, they start schmoozing. Where are you from? Guy says, I'm from Texas. He says, what do you do? Guy says, I raise chickens. I'm a farmer. Texas guy says, oh, I'm also a farmer. How much land do you have? He says to the Israeli bodega owner. So the Israeli says, well, I have about 50 meters out there in the front. You can see outside the front of this little window. And I have about 100 meters in the back of my store. This guy from Texas laughs and he says, my 50 meters, 100 meters. He says, you know what happens back home? Back home, I go wake up in the morning, get in my car, be in my car from breakfast till lunch, and not drive to the end of my property. The guy from Israel says, yes, I also have a car like that. Tonight, we're going to be learning about the most current strain of anti-Semitism. Tonight's class is called The Promised Land. We're going to be focusing on a modern form of anti-Semitism, the attempt to destroy or weaken the state of Israel, God forbid, which ultimately would threaten the safety and the well-being of millions of Jews that currently live in the Holy Land. Believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, we've talked a lot about anti-Semitism being this sort of global issue, right? There are people all around the world that are focused on anti-Semitism. We have to figure out what that means. And it might surprise you. It might surprise you to know that in today's day and age, in 2021, the epicenter of global anti-Semitism is a piece of real estate that is roughly the size of New Jersey. The heart of so much anti-Semitism around the world, really the focus of both historic and primarily modern anti-Semitism is focused on a teeny tiny piece of land in the Middle East. And tonight we're going to talk about, as we have throughout this course, we're going to talk about why. Why is it that so much hatred is centered on Israel? And more importantly, what can we do about that? I remember this moment quite clearly myself. I don't know if any of you remember the first time you were pointed to Israel on a map or on a globe. The first time you were really given to understand by scale how small Israel is. And this might sound a little callous, and I don't mean this in the wrong way, but almost how insignificant Israel is. Specifically, when you look at Israel in the context of all of its Middle Eastern neighbors, and you see these giant behemoths of countries that surround it and all seem to have one focus in life and one focus at all, and that is just obsessively picking. Why is that? I'm going to say this. I've taught over COVID and in my substitute teacher career a number of JLI classes, and I've never been so almost wary ahead of time about how contentious this issue might get. There's going to be a lot of strong opinions in the room tonight. I have no doubt of that. I look forward to a robust discussion and us really digging into the issues. And with that, let's take a look at tonight's lesson video.
On the eastern shore of Manhattan Island, the United Nations headquarters rises from a row of colored flags that represent a multitude of nations. Across the avenue, the Isaiah wall proclaims a Jewish prophet's vision of universal peace. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. The UN's mission is precisely that, to resolve armed conflicts and to foster global harmony. But inside the august chambers of the United Nations, founded in 1945 as a response to a war-ravaged world desperate for coexistence, Isaiah could have easily found himself the target of virulent condemnation had he survived into modern times. Isaiah lived in ancient Israel that for over a millennia included the territories that the UN considers illegally occupied by today's Jewish state. The Temple Mount that lies at the heart of Isaiah's prophecy is no longer considered by the UN to be the heritage or possession of the Jewish people. Indeed, the tiny country that Isaiah called home has become the focus of the majority of the UN's denunciations and has inspired more censure than all of today's tyrants put together. Iran, North Korea, and other brutal regimes systematically kill their citizens or deny them the most basic of human rights. Israel's northern neighbor, Syria, has murdered tens of thousands of innocent civilians. Apparently, however, that isn't very important in the eyes of the UN General Assembly and Security Council, who continually pass one-sided resolutions that single out and condemn Israel. An overwhelmingly powerful bloc led by the Arab nations promotes a narrow and slanderous agenda meant to isolate Israel. This agenda has met little resistance. The UN's General Assembly votes on 70 to 100 resolutions annually. 15 to 20 of these regularly express disapproval of Israel. From 2016 until 2020, the Assembly adopted 122 resolutions criticizing various countries. 91 of these targeted Israel. That's 75% of all country-specific resolutions. And while 3/4 of this global forum's written rage lambastes the Jewish state, precious few of the most repressive or blood-soaked regimes on earth have received even a single rebuke. Emergency special sessions of the Assembly are rare. During the last 40 years, they've been convened for one purpose only: to condemn Israel. The Assembly's embrace of a terrorist entity has been equally astounding. In October 1974, 14 years before the Palestinian Liberation Organization even nominally forced war terrorism, the Assembly voted to invite a PLO spokesman to take part in its deliberations. This was the first time that anyone who is neither a government representative nor a head of a quasi-state was granted such a privilege. The following year, the Assembly awarded the PLO permanent representative status. A few months later, the UN infamously approved Resolution 3379, branding Zionism as a form of racism. At the time, Israel's UN ambassador, Chaim Herzog, told his fellow delegates that Hitler would have felt at home listening to the UN debate on the measure.
For us, the Jewish people, this is no more than a piece of paper, and we should treat it as such.
Since the 1993 Oslo Accords, hundreds of Israelis have been killed and thousands injured by Palestinian terror attacks. During the same period, the UN passed dozens of resolutions deploring Israel, but not one against the terror attacks. Since the 2006 creation of the UN's Human Rights Council, most of the world's human rights abusers have suffered nary a mild rebuke. Israel, on the other hand, is chastised as often as all of the rest of the countries combined, and in terms more condemnatory. At the Council's every meeting, a topic billed as, quote, human rights situation in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories is raised as a separate agenda item, while the remaining totality of mankind constitutes a single other point on the agenda. From 2006 to May 2021, Israel was condemned in no less than 94 Human Rights Council resolutions. During the same period, Syria was condemned 36 times, North Korea 14 times, and China has been spared condemnation altogether. Even within the walls of the UN, the absurdity of its anti-Israel bias is fleetingly, partially acknowledged. In September 2006, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan conceded.
Supporters of Israel feel that it is harshly judged by standards that are not applied to its enemies. And too often this is true, particularly in some UN bodies.
In August 2013, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon reflected on Israel's treatment of the UN. In December 2016, he told the UN Security Council,
a disproportionate volume of resolutions, reports, and conferences criticizing Israel.
one of the more telling comments came inadvertently in November 2013, when a UN interpreter failed to silence her microphone as she addressed her colleague.
I mean, I think when you have 5 statements, not 5, but a total of 10 resolutions on Israel and Palestine, there's got to be something formal. I mean, I know it's yes, true, but it's not the obvious. I don't really have an resistance, but the other stuff. Apologies.
I understand that the problem is interpretation.
Israel is not larger than 8,019 square miles in total. It is the Middle East's only functioning democracy and champion of human rights. It is a world provider of humanitarian disaster relief and medical, agricultural, ecological, scientific, technological, and security innovations. But when seen through the lens of historical UN bias, the overwhelming majority of all the world's evils and all the world's ills belong to the tiny Jewish homeland in which Isaiah spoke his vision of swords being beaten into plowshares.
Okay, if I could leave you with one reality from this somewhat disturbing video, I think the groundwork for tonight's class is that people seem to have a pretty large size problem with the land of Israel and the people that inhabit the land of Israel. I don't know that's a premise that anyone's going to really take issue with, but I'd be accurate in assuming as much. I think if you came to this course, you're one who would acknowledge that anti-Semitism is an issue, and if you acknowledge that anti-Semitism is an issue, it's a pretty quick jump to acknowledge that there's a particular strain of anti-Semitism which is now directed as anti-Israel sentiment. Are we all in agreement on this more to some extent or another? Let's read text 1 together. On page 84 from Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Anti-Semitism is not an ideology, a coherent set of beliefs. It is, in fact, an endless stream of contradictions. The best way of understanding it is to see it as a virus. Viruses attack the human body, but the body itself has an immensely sophisticated defense, the human immune system. How then do viruses survive and flourish? By mutating. Anti-Semitism mutates, and in so doing, defeats the immune system set up by cultures to protect themselves against hatred. Most people at most times feel a residual guilt at hating the innocent. Therefore, anti-Semitism has always had to find legitimation in the most prestigious source of authority at any given time. In the first centuries of the Common Era, and again in the Middle Ages, this was religion. This is why Judeophobia took the form of religious doctrine. In the 19th century, religion had lost prestige and supreme authority was now science. Racial anti-Semitism was duly based on 2 pseudosciences: social Darwinism, the idea that in society as in nature, the strong survive by eliminating the weak, and the so-called scientific study of race. By the late 20th century, science had lost its prestige, having given us the power to destroy life on Earth. Today, the supreme source of legitimacy is human rights. That is why Jews or the Jewish state are accused of the 5 primal sins against human rights: racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, attempted genocide, and crimes against humanity. I think we live in a day and age. Rabbi Sachs passed away during the COVID, not from COVID, but I think as we live now in the COVID age, this example of a mutating virus is one that we can all appreciate. You know, we're living right now within COVID itself, within the Delta strain, and we know that, things that we once thought were effective against COVID are not effective against the Delta strain. And this idea of an ever mutating virus is sadly something which we can all relate to, the constant mutation of a virus. Well, in the opinion of Lord Rabbi Sachs, Anti-Semitism is a virus, and a virus takes on different strains and different mutations. In the earlier ages, in the classical era, in the Middle Ages, it was about religion. We hated Jews because of their religion. The Christians hated Jews because they rejected and killed their savior. The Muslims hated Jews because they rejected their prophet and their religion. Anti-Semitism was garbed in this mutation called religion. We cared about religion, and Jews didn't jive with our religion. So boom, anti-Semitism is now somehow legitimized. Then what happened in the 19th century? Well, the world stopped caring about religion. Well, you stop caring about religion, you have no good reason to dislike the Jews. So we started caring about something else. And we started caring about something called science. Started caring about something called science. And oh, it's the Jews who bring about the Black Plague. And the Jews are somehow anti-science, or the Jews believe in some sort of pseudoscience. So science being our North Star somehow again legitimized anti-Semitism. Now we live in a much better world where we don't care about religion. Now we don't care about science. Instead, we care about something else entirely, and that thing is called human rights. We live in a world where it's now all about who is the weakest and what can we do to protect the weakest, and we have now decided that the Jews hate human rights. The Israelis hate human rights, and the Israelis, to put in the Thomas words of Lord Sachs, are guilty of the 5 primal sins against human rights: racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, attempted genocide, and crimes against humanity. Give me 1 second. Let me be abundantly clear here for a moment. Obviously, when we speak about the people of Israel are folks just like you and me. When we speak about the land of Israel, let's be clear. The land of Israel, the state of Israel, is a state that is run by politicians who are flesh and blood. I would say it's run by Jewish politicians, but Israel is so bad at being an apartheid state, they haven't even figured out how to do that properly. There are actually Arab politicians, which also govern the land of Israel. To say it's all the Jewish politicians would not even be accurate. But just for argument's sake, Israel is run by politicians who are flesh and blood and who are not infallible, and they make mistakes. So let's agree for a moment that it's fair to criticize the government of Israel as fair as it is to criticize the government of America or France or England or any other country in the world. As we speak, this evening, there are hundreds of people at the state capitol who are criticizing their government. Tonight, the redistricting committee is putting out the way they want to lay out congressional districts and local districts and school board districts, and there are dozens and dozens of people up there who are complaining about those plans. Now, I don't think anyone's going to say that all those people are anti-Mormon, assuming that an overwhelming majority of our elected officials in the state belong to the predominant faith. No one's going to say that all those people that are protesting against redistricting have some sort of anti-LDS bias inside them. You can have legitimate complaints against your government. And yet it seems like the UN may be taking that to a little bit of an extreme. Yet I think we can all agree that the anti-Israel sentiment that exists in this world is not about having fair criticisms of a duly elected democratic government. So the question we will grapple with tonight, well, then we'll take Ilana's question. The question we will grapple with tonight is how might we differentiate between legitimate criticism of Israel and criticism motivated by anti-Semitism? For the record, if you take a look at figure 3.2 on page 87, which was a survey conducted with Jews who consider themselves pro-Israel by the Melman Group in 2018. The respondents were asked which of the following best describes you: generally pro-Israel and supportive of the government, generally pro-Israel, also critical of some of the policies, generally pro-Israel but critical of many of the policies, or generally not pro-Israel. You'll notice that 91% of the respondents consider themselves pro-Israel, and yet 59% of those respondents, whilst they are pro-Israel, will tell you that the government in Israel are human. And as such, some of their decisions leave a little bit to be lacking. I don't think that's somehow wrong or inappropriate or anti-Semitic or anything of the sort. There is a concept of having fair criticism of a democratically elected government. And yet, at some point, that crosses over into anti-Semitism. Where do we draw that line? Ilana, I will take the question.
Oh, yeah. So I just wanted to put on the table a different view of the three different sources of anti-Semitism. So you said religion and science. So for science, I would, it's in the anti-Semitic claim. I think it's more race. Yeah, it's like you're thinking of the Jews as a race. But then what I find is interesting is that the current anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism is really, if you look at the human rights figures, I mean pictures, what you see is that we have evolved from the 20th century to now to a world where before nationalism was the thing, yeah. So we were every country was nationalist, and what was the critique of the Jews? That they were a population that had that between a Jew, an American Jew, or let's say a European Jew and a German Jew, a French Jew and a German Jew, there is this connection.
Dual loyalties.
Not just dual loyalty, but loyalty among themselves.
Got it.
International loyalty to the Jews. It's like you can go anywhere in the world and you will find a place in the Jewish faith. And now the world has split, and we are aspiring, or at least on the left, the idea is nationalism is bad, and we are supposed to be like this kind of one people because everybody is kind of the same world. And so now what the Jews are guilty of is actually being attached to one nation.
Got it.
And so I think that really helps kind of seeing where is this anti-Semitism coming from, because otherwise, before it was mostly on the right, yeah, because the problem was the nationalism. So you get the anti-Semitism coming from the right. But now the anti-Semitism is largely coming from the left. And the reason is because it goes against that.
Fair enough.
So I think that's
Fair enough. Fair enough. Thank you for that. Okay. In our first attempt to answer this question, we are going to express one idea in two texts that are approximately 3,000 years apart, but bring out a similar idea. We're going to see an idea expressed in the Medrash, which was then expressed in similar words by our friend Natan Sharansky, who we've visited with in lesson number 1. So Susan, why don't you read for us text 2 on page 88, and then Michael will read for us text 3 on page 89.
Holy cow, I don't even know this guy's name.
Imi Kantron.
Imi Kantron wrote to Emperor Hadrian.
Yes.
Hadrian. If it is circumcision that you hate, Arabian tribes also circumcise. If it is Shabbat observance that you despise, the Kuthians similarly observe Shabbat. Clearly then, you simply hate the Jewish people. There God will exact punishment from you.
Michael, text 3.
I believe that we can apply a simple test I call the 3D test to help us distinguish legitimate criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism. The first D is the test of demonization. When the Jewish state is being demonized, when Israel's actions are blown out of all sensible proportion, when comparisons are made between Israelis and Nazis, and between Palestinian refugee camps and Auschwitz, this is anti-Semitism, not legitimate criticism of Israel. The second D is the test of double standards. When criticism of Israel is applied selectively, when Israel is singled out by the United Nations for human rights abuses while the behavior of known and major abusers, such as China, Iran, Cuba, and Syria, is ignored, when Israel's Magen David's Adom, alone among the world's ambulance services, is denied admission to the International Red Cross, this is anti-Semitism. The third D is the test of delegitimization, when Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied. Alone among all people in the world, this too is anti-Semitism.
So about 3,000 years ago, there was a very anti-Semitic emperor. His name was Hadrian. And one of the members of his people said to him, I don't understand what your problem is. If you have a problem with people who circumcise their children, you should have a problem with a great many nations of this world. If you have a problem with people who keep Shabbat, you should have a problem with a great many nations in this world. Yet I don't see you take issue with the Arabians or the Kufians. It only seems to be the Jews you have a problem. Clearly, your problem is not an issue with circumcision or Shabbat. You're an anti-Semite. To put it in the words of Sharansky has what he calls the 3D test of anti-Semitism. Demonization, double standards, and delegitimization. Michael, I'm going to struggle with that word much like you did. Demonization. You have a problem with the Israeli government? Yeah, that's probably fair. It's likely accurate to say that as a result of that, Israel is the worst country on earth. You might be jumping a little bit too far there, Skipper. Double standards. If you have a problem with things that are done by the Israeli government, and you do not have a problem with similar actions or worse actions that are done by other nations on the face of God's good earth, you might have jumped a little bit too far there, Skipper. And most importantly, delegitimization. If you feel like because of the problems of Israel's government, quote, Israel doesn't have a right to exist, you might be getting out in front of your skis, as they say here in the great state of Utah. So Sharansky's point is pretty straightforward. If you have something to complain about, if you have criticisms of Israel's government or Israel's policies, apply the 3D test. If your complaints survive the 3D test, then great. Then we should take up your criticisms with the powers that be, and maybe we can affect change. If they fail the 3D test, then I'm sorry, I don't really think this is legitimate criticism, but this might fall under the category of anti-Semitism, which leads me to make the point. It's fascinating. It's fascinating how allergic people are to the term anti-Semitism. It's trendy to hate Israel. It's also trendy not to be an anti-Semite. It's interesting how we live in a world where people will go out of their way to subscribe to a certain belief, yet the notion that I am somehow against a group of people, God forbid. Oh, God forbid. Oh, heavens no. I'm not an anti-Semite. I am just merely fill in the blank, oppressive regimes. And that is why I believe that Jews all around the world are evil. But God forbid, not anti-Semitism. No. How dare you? How dare you accuse me of taking adopting such a racist mentality, which, according to Sharansky, I'm afraid if the only oppressive regime that you have a problem with in this world happens to be the Jewish one, much as you run from the title, you might well qualify for an anti-Semite, and you might just have to do it. Now, these issues are alarming. When anyone violates the 3D test, it is truly alarming. And there are things that we can do about it. It's important that we support organizations that help advance Israel's interests and fight against anti-Semitism. As we well know, from just anti-Semitism in thought and speech to Jews being attacked in the homeland is quite a small jump. It's important that we engage in spiritual endeavors to support the Jews in Israel. We talked about in lesson 1, but what we're really going to focus on tonight is when things get worse. As much as a problem as it is that all the nice folks in the UN seem to have an issue with Israel, there is something worse than just the powers that be in the United Nations having a problem with Israel. And that is when Jews join. When members of the Jewish people adopt anti-Semitic positions, whether knowingly or unknowingly, which, as we know in today's day and age, specifically against Jews from my generation, from the younger generations, this is becoming more and more of a problem. Because when that happens, when Jews take anti-Semitic positions, obviously it gives a tremendous amount of legitimacy and strength to those who have those positions, and it's something which we want to deal with. And then we're a little pressed for time. Let me just get through this point. Yes. I would define Jews as someone who was born to a Jewish mom.
Oh, so okay. So
Yes, and I don't believe that my criteria for what is or is not a Jew makes this problem any less compelling. There are many halachic Jews who also support anti-Semitism. But be that as it may, when Jews join forces with those that hate us, it gives them legitimacy and strength. We see this actually historically. Last week, and the week before, but primarily last week, we talked about the most raving anti-Semite that ever walked the earth. That was Haman. Remember last week we talked about ditch anti-Semitism and mound anti-Semitism, and Haman represented mound anti-Semitism. Historically, the Jewish people have been challenged by two different types of anti-Semites who represent two different forms of anti-Semitism. Last week, we talked about the fact that Haman was the far worse anti-Semite than his colleague Achashverosh. Achashverosh was the ditch anti-Semite, whereas Haman was the pile anti-Semite. So now we're going to take that a step further. There are two types of anti-Semitism that our people have been challenged by historically. The first is called Purim anti-Semitism, or Haman anti-Semitism. Haman anti-Semitism makes its aims quite clear. Total destruction of the Jewish people. In today's day and age, we would refer to that as from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. We make our aims quite clear. We are looking at destruction of the Jewish people. Let's use clearer words to talk about destruction. Murder, death, annihilation, genocide. We want dead Jews. When anti-Semitism is clothed in the garb of dead Jews, of murder of the Jewish people, it makes it increasingly difficult for Jewish people to take up this cause. At the end of the day, confused as they may be, it is very difficult for people who are members of the Jewish faith, of the Jewish people, to support the total annihilation of their people. Disclaimer, you may well have seen, whether they have been depicted in the media, if you've gone to AIPAC, you may have seen them in person. Religious-looking Jews who support the annihilation of the state of Israel and the people of Israel. Let me be abundantly clear for the record. There are people in this world who struggle severely with mental illness. We're going to speak about people tonight who have the capacity for sane thought, for rational conversation, and I'm not speaking about people who, with the payas and the black hat and the black coats, stand outside the conference center in Washington, D.C., calling for the death of the Jewish people. This is not the conversation that we're going to be having tonight. As I say, this is not a disagreement of opinion or somehow a difference of rationale. There is mental illness at play over there, and that's not really the topic at hand. So, Purim anti-Semitism. Destroy the Jewish people. Yeah, it's difficult for Jewish people to support the destruction of the Jewish people. And then we have Hanukkah anti-Semitism. What we're going to refer to tonight as Antiochus anti-Semitism. Who was Antiochus? Antiochus was the ruler of the Syrian Greeks who ruled from 175 to 164 BCE. He was effectively the ruler of the Jewish people. At that time, the Syrian Greeks ruled over what we know now to be the land of Israel. And Antiochus had issues not with Jews. He had issues with Judaism. As we're going to talk about tonight, there is a large-sized gap between having issues with Jews and with Judaism. At his core, Antiochus, as much as he presented himself, did not want to harm the hair on the head of a single Jew. He was not in it for pain and suffering. No, he had issues with Judaism. In Antiochus' mind, Antiochus was someone who promulgated Hellenism, and Hellenism and Judaism were at odds one with the other. And so Antiochus sought out to outlaw specific areas of Judaism. God bless the Jewish people. They're lovely. Lovely, I say. They make matzah balls and so many other delightful delicacies. We don't want to get rid of the Jewish people. No. We want to make modifications to Judaism. And so there's various versions exactly what Antiochus sought out to outlaw. But to be specific, it was a very, very narrow path. According to most opinions, it was circumcision, Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, various observances of Jewish law, but that's all he was really out against. In his mind, if you wanted to support Hellenism, which was the flavor of the day that Antiochus was selling, you do not have to renounce Judaism. And here's where we really get into thorny waters. There were multiple Jews that adopted the ethos of Hellenism in the story of Hanukkah and crossed over to the other side. The point that they made in the story of Hanukkah is a profound one, and I think here is really where the issues lie. By adopting Hellenism, by taking on the thought process of Antiochus, we are not turning our backs against our faith. You know what we're doing? We're saving Judaism. Judaism owes us a debt of gratitude. The religion is floundering, it's drowning in a deep sea, and we are the ones who are forward-thinking enough, selfless enough to throw it a life raft. We are saving Judaism. In fact, we have the ability to take on a sophisticated worldview. We have the ability to mesh together ancient traditions with modern perspectives. We are trying to save Judaism. We are trying to bring Judaism into the 21st century. And really, this is what all Jews should be doing. This is called Hanukkah antisemitism. Let's see this idea expressed in text 4. Antonino, page 91. Text 4, go for it.
Hanukkah anti-Semitism doesn't demand dead or expel Jews, at least not at first. Instead, it demands the destruction of Jewish civilization. This process requires not dead Jews, but Jews who are willing to give up whatever specific aspect of Jewish civilization is deemed to be uncool. Of course, Judaism has always been uncool, which is why cool people find it so threatening. And why Jews who are willing to become cool are absolutely necessary to Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism success. In the days of Antiochus, this type of anti-Semitism needed those boys who voluntarily underwent painful genital surgery to prove that Jews weren't a problem, just the barbarity of Jewish law. Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism always promises Jews a kind of nobility, offering them the opportunity to cleanse themselves of whatever the people around them find revolting. The Jewish traits designated as repulsive vary by country and time period, but they invariably contradict the specific value that the surrounding culture has embraced as universal. Thanks to Judaism's inherent uncoolness, there will never be a shortage of Jews willing to conform.
So let's take these two models of Purim anti-Semitism and Hanukkah anti-Semitism and put them into the 21st century. ISIS puts a video on YouTube. We need to wipe out the Jews. I'm yet to see a student organization that calls itself Jews for ISIS. This is a line that is yet to be crossed. For Jews to join in the quest for the caliphate and to call for the death of other Jews, we haven't gotten there yet. Jews don't support ISIS. But sadly, there's no shortage of Jews that will tell you that Judaism, Israel, is a genocidal, apartheid pile of garbage that needs to be radically changed. Judaism, the Jewish people living in Israel are engaging in ethnic cleansing of the indigenous Palestinian people. And here's the kicker. Here's the kicker. You know what the most important thing for a Jew to do is? The most important thing for a Jew to do is to be anti-Israel. They're not coming to reform, they're not coming to get rid of Judaism. You're missing the point. The most pro-Jewish thing that a Jew can do, the most inline reality that is congruent with Jewish values is to be anti-Israel. Why? Why? Because the Jewish people in Israel, the Israeli government, are racist and genocidal, and they're apartheid, and they don't let women. I don't know what they don't let women do, and they're engaged in ethnic cleansing, and you can go up and down the list. And the most Jewish thing that you can do is to be anti-Israel. It's funny we're speaking about Hanukkah anti-Semitism. I want to tell you guys a fresh story. Last Wednesday, I was invited to teach a class at the University of Utah, to a student group, a Jewish student group at the University of Utah. They have a monthly lecture. They invited me to come talk to the students on Wednesday night. So I figured, what am I going to talk about? It's Hanukkah. Hanukkah's coming, it's only 3 weeks away. I'm going to go on campus and speak to the Jewish students, the undergrads, about Hanukkah. So I printed up a source sheet, 8 nights, 8 ideas of Hanukkah. And one of the ideas that I spoke about are the Maccabees. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the Maccabees, right? Pretty Jewish idea, the Maccabees of Hanukkah. Judah, the Maccabee, the sword and the shield and the Judah and the Maccabee. Like, is there any more Jewish theme than Judah the Maccabee? Spoke about the Maccabees, who were basically a band of merry men who had like kitchen equipment going up against the most powerful army on earth. And from here we learn it's not about the size and it's not about the arsenal, it's about the spirit, the courage and the heart, blah, blah, blah. I kid you not. An undergrad at the University of Utah raises his hand. And he says, Rabbi, I would appreciate if we didn't speak about the Maccabees. Okay, sure. Why? See, he says, because I saw a documentary last year that says that in the course of the battle of Hanukkah, there was a military battle that was involved in the story of Hanukkah. The Maccabees killed members of the Jewish faith who had fraternized with the Greek army. As we learned about tonight, there were Jews who went over to the dark side, as it were, and promoted Hellenism. And in the process of the war of Hanukkah, the Maccabees killed members of the Jewish faith that were promulgating Hellenism. And so the Maccabees were evil. The Maccabees, they don't deserve the accolades that have been given to them throughout the generations. It's no longer a Jewish ideal to talk about the Maccabees. So to be clear, this was not a Christian kid coming to me and saying, look, Rabbi, as a Catholic, as a Muslim, I want to tell you I'm offended by the Maccabees because the Maccabees did this and this and this. And for the fact that the Jewish people speak so highly of the Maccabees is offensive to my faith. No, Rabbi, you got to get with the times. If you support the Maccabees, you're a racist because the Maccabees killed Jews that they didn't agree with. And so the Maccabees are not woke. So stop speaking about the Maccabees. It's become now anti-Jewish to speak fondly about the Maccabees. It's become anti-Jewish to support Israel. Why? Because the world's values nowadays don't mesh with the behavior of the Israeli government. And so therefore, the best thing that a Jew can do is to be anti-Israel. So this is pretty straightforward. I said we're going to have to agree to disagree. I have never found it very successful to engage in a complete change of historical narrative at the 21. I'm sorry, I'm not much older than 21 myself, but still, I think there's a gap there. Yes, Mike.
Isn't it simple fraternization with the enemies and that is traitorous behavior?
Again, if this were a conversation that were somehow steeped in reason,
okay.
I'm going to agree with you here, sir.
There is also an anti-Israeli current that is coming from what I think you were describing before, which is religious current.
Again, we're not, so the only religious current of anti-Semitism, again, and I would be very clear on this, and I don't mean to be demeaning, in my opinion, is absolute mental illness.
But I mean, their argument, if I remember correctly, their argument is only God can bring.
Okay, there are, sure. Let me be clear. There are schools of thought within Israel as to the level of sanctity that is involved in the Zionist movement. Now, to be clear, a lot of the people who make this argument, most of the people who make this argument, live in Israel. So they're not calling for the destruction of a land, and they're not calling for the abolition of a government, and they're not calling for a single head to rule. There's a philosophical argument as to whether Zionism, as we understand it, is a godly entity or a human entity. Even those that will tell you that it's not a godly entity will not say, and therefore we now call for Prime Minister Bennett's head on a stick. No, he is the duly elected Prime Minister of the land of the state of Israel. Whether that gives him some sort of spiritual perch is an argument that can be had, but no one will debate that he is a government leader, he's a Jew, and as such is worthy of our support. So what do we do? What do we do when we bump up against Hanukkah anti-Semitism that is somehow garbed in this, crusade of being pro-Jews? Well, the reality of the situation is we're dealing with a lot of ignorance. And I think the key place where we can start is educating ourselves from a very, very basic level as to what Israel is and why it has a right to exist. We're going to touch on three crucial points tonight on the right that Israel has to exist. You hear this line a lot. Israel's right to exist. Israel does have a right to exist, or it doesn't have a right to exist, which is a conversation you will not hear about another civilized land in the face of this earth. I've never gotten into an argument. Does Argentina have a right to exist? I don't think so. But let's go down that road for a second. Let's have a conversation as to, does Israel have a right to exist? By and large, as we understand it in the world we live in today, the idea of Israel's right to exist is broken down into three common arguments. The first one is extremely straightforward, and that is called international law. In 1922, there was something called the Balfour Declaration. What is the Balfour Declaration? Well, at the end of World War I, the powers that controlled what was the land of Israel, the Ottoman Empire, fell in World War I. And the British mandate for Palestine, which is something which was passed in the League of Nations. The League of Nations is kind of the predecessor of the United Nations. The League of Nations approved of the Balfour Mandate for Palestine. The British mandate put in place a land which would be given to the people of Palestine. I digress, strictly for my own entertainment. The people of Palestine, you know who they were referring to? Jews. There's a lot of talk around, did you know that the Balfour Mandate was for Palestine? Yes. Do you know who lived in Israel under the Balfour Mandate for Palestine? Jews. Again, I digress. In 1947, as the United Nations had been formed, the United Nations approved of a partition plan for the land of Israel. Some of it was going to be for the Jews, some of it was going to be for the Arabs. The Jewish community then living in Israel approved of the partition plan, and on May 14th, 1948, what we know now as Yom HaAtzmaut, the state of Israel was approved of and was established by the United Nations. There have been dozens of nations that have been formed since 1948. You know why you don't know about most of them? Because the United Nations is not holding assemblies to discuss whether they have a right to exist or not. They were formed, they were given a spot by the UN, and sayonara, they live on in peace. Just like all those nations have a right to exist, the Jewish people, the Jewish land, was given that right to exist by international law on May 14th, 1940. Point number two, Jewish survival. Why is it that indeed the forming of a land, not under the British Mandate of Palestine, but under the land of Israel, took place specifically after World War II? Because World War II expressed the dire need for the Jewish people to have a land in which they could survive. Over the course of the Holocaust of the 1930s and 40s, it became increasingly clear that the Jewish people needed a land they could call their own, which would be their homeland where they could go in the case of persecution. We know stories upon stories, even stories involving the good old United States of America, that happened over the Holocaust, where the US closed its doors to Jews who were trying to flee war-torn Europe. We know that over the course of the Holocaust, as Allied forces were fighting against the Germans, they also refused to bomb the tracks that were leading to the concentration camps. And so over the course of World War II, it became abundantly clear the Jewish people needed a land to call their own. As a stateless people, the Jewish people were a powerless people. And so, to maintain Jewish survival, they were given a land. Laura has a comment, I'm sorry. In addition to the Balfour Declaration, the San Remo Conference of 1920 reaffirmed Balfour. That's right, thank you. Point number three, and that is a very, very basic idea, which is referred to as history. There is no doubt that our people have a historical connection with the land of Israel. We're talking about the land where the reigns of David and Solomon, the kingdoms of Judah and Israel, where the Maccabees fought, where so much of our history has taken place. This is the land that we have always called home. Even whilst Israel was under foreign rule, there were always Jews living in the land of Israel for thousands of years. This week I saw on social media In this week's Torah portion, we read about the union of Jacob and Rachel. And someone actually found the spot today in the land of Israel where Jacob and Rachel first saw each other 4,500 years ago, as dictated to us by the Torah. It exists today in the land of Israel. There's no any other idea of a historical claim that we lay to that land. I don't know what other historical claim we might have. This has literally been the land of our patriarchs and matriarchs for thousands and thousands of years. And even those who didn't live in the land of Israel, we know this is the land that Jews around the world have included in their hopes, their prayers, and their dreams for millennia. There has always been a strong historical connection to the land of Israel. But my friends, for every good argument, there's always a counter argument. Let's see where this takes us. Joan, if you read for us, please, text 5 on page 94.
When I was a Jewish kid growing up in suburban Los Angeles, we thought being Jewish meant supporting Israel. It really wasn't a choice. If you identify as Jewish, as I and most of my friends did, the religious education we got, youth groups we joined, and summer camps where we played were all grounded in one thing. It wasn't God, it was Zionism, the political project of settling Jewish people in Israel. My own break with Zionism came in my mid-20s after reading the letters of Zionism's founder, Theodore Herzl, and Florence Cecil Rhodes, the leader of British land, theft in Africa, to support his work in Palestine. Their projects were both something colonial. Herzl shared words.
Aha! The undoing, the justification for anti-Semitism. A Jewish woman was raised in LA. Could you think of like a more Jewish hotbed? And she was raised to be pro-Israel. And then, my friends, she was let in on a little secret. The secret which the Jews don't want the other Jews to know about. Herzl was a colonialist. Theodore Herzl, the grandfather of Zionism, wrote a letter to Cecil Rhodes in which he shared that the founding of Palestine was something colonial. And now, ladies and gentlemen, our dear friend Phyllis Bennis, who wrote an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times called "I'm Jewish, I fight anti-Semitism, and I support Palestinian rights," our dear friend Phyllis has now been justified in her quest to support Palestinian rights. Why? Because Herzl was a colonialist. I mean, she might be interested to know Herzl beyond anything, whether he was a colonialist or not. Herzl was a gifted politician. And Theodore Herzl, I'm sure, like many, many politicians, said one thing to one person. It's very possible said another thing to another person. And I don't say that as an anti-Semite. I think every politician, Jewish, Muslim, black, white, or purple on the face of God's good earth has said multiple things to multiple people which have multiple different interpretations. So let's assume for a sec that Theodore Herzl was a barking colonialist, the worst of any kind, right? How does that somehow delegitimize from the points that we made about Israel's right to exist? We put up 3 common arguments. Well, for every common argument, there's going to be a counter argument. Let's start with international law. The Balfour Mandate, the British mandate for the people of Palestine, supported by the League of Nations, then by the United Nations, who cares? It's immoral. It's colonialism. The British people had no right to give it to the Jewish people. The League of Nations had no right to give it to the Jewish people. Certainly the UN had no right to give it to the Jewish people. They're all racist. They're all immoral. Something happened in international law? Too bad. No, there are plenty of things that happen in international law, and the United States will tell you they're justified to do a whole bunch of things which are immoral, and every government does things which are immoral. So don't tell me because there was a Balfour Mandate, et cetera, that somehow legitimizes the existence of the Jewish state. It doesn't. It was immoral. In argument, what are you going to say to that? It's not immoral. I think it is immoral. So it's immoral. So you have international law at your back? Too bad. You and your laws, they're all immoral. Jewish survival? You know that in the 1940s, before the UN gave the Jewish people Israel, they offered them an alternative. You know what they offered them? Uganda. They offered them a beautiful stretch of land in sub-Saharan Africa, which I will make a point for the record. The amount of land they offered them in Africa is roughly 4 times the size of what the land of Israel is today. Had a lot more real estate. I've been to Israel. People live on top of each other. It's crowded and it's packed. People are on each other's heads. It could have been beautiful. Everyone could have had a front yard and a backyard and a Uganda. You want a land? No problem. There's no shortage of lands around the world. We'll give you a land. It has to be Dafka in the Middle East? No. You'll have your land in Africa. Why do you need this stretch of land? Furthermore, to make a fair point, we know now, the world that we live in post-Holocaust, that having all the world's Jews or a significant portion of the world's Jews in one single stretch of land that is roughly the size of New Jersey might not always be the best thing for Jewish continuity. In 1967, in the era of the Six-Day War, Israel's neighbors that literally surrounded it thought they were pretty well off to wipe the Jewish nation off the face of the map because they had them cornered from every side. So having the entirety of the Jewish world in one stretch of real estate, not necessarily the best idea if you really want to speak about Jewish survival. But then let's talk about history. History. So over a period of time, there were Jews living in this land. So therefore what? So now you have a right to it forever and ever, and you can drive out whoever lives there. Tomorrow, a Dutch ship should pull up in the New York harbor and lay claim to Manhattan. Because 1,000 years ago, the Dutch were living in what we now know to be New York City. So if we're going to go down the history road, Lord knows what's going to happen here in Utah. I mean, the Native Americans are going to send us flying, but where does it end? 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, 200 years ago, your people once lived in this land, okay? So therefore what? You somehow retain an eternal card that you hold on to, that you could drive whoever lives in that land out of that land because you once lived there? When does that end? At what point do your rights to the land somehow dry up? I'm glad to hear David lived there, and Solomon lived there, and the Maccabees lived there, and Jacob and Rachel. That is great. But when does that end? So for every argument, there's a counter-argument. For international law and Jewish survival and history, there's a counter-argument. Clearly, if we really want to understand this, we have to dig a little deeper. We have to have a little bit of a perspective shift in how contemporary Jews see the conversation around the land of Israel and give them the opportunity to see this differently. There was once a gentleman who wrote a letter to the Rebbe. And in the letter to the Rebbe that he wrote, he was complaining about a state of affairs that he had witnessed with his own eyes. He once came into a synagogue and he saw there was a Jew that had attended the synagogue, that was there in the synagogue, because they needed a minyan, needed a quorum of 10 men. And the man is sitting there in the synagogue, and he's literally sitting in the synagogue reading a newspaper. Many of you might remember there used to be a period in time where every morning this thing called a newspaper was delivered to your front door. Yes, it sounds familiar. We used to make your fingers black. It was like very big, you know, newspaper. Yes, I know nowadays everyone's going out of print. But there was a period of time when there were newspapers that were readily available. And this gentleman came to services. He came to be there at the services reading the newspaper. So whoever had observed this reality sent a letter to the Rebbe decrying the state of affairs that a Jew came to synagogue reading the newspaper. The Rebbe wrote him back a powerful, powerful letter. It's printed, it's available online. And the Rebbe told him that this gentleman sees the situation completely the wrong way. This is not about a lack of respect that a Jew came to synagogue holding a newspaper. It's about a lack of education. It is about a lack of education. And the Rebbe wrote, had this man received the proper Jewish education, his flame could have been nurtured. The Rebbe made the argument, this man has a vibrant Jewish soul inside him. And he yearns to connect with his faith, which is why he's at services, which is why he's there. He cared to be in the room. Once he got into the room, he didn't know what to do with it. So he read a newspaper. Phyllis Bennis is her last name. Phyllis Bennis is a Jew. Phyllis Bennis has a Jewish soul. And as a result of Phyllis Bennis' Jewish soul, she cares very deeply about the land of Israel. Do you know what Phyllis Bennis does not have? Jewish education. And if Phyllis Bennis were educated as to what Judaism is and what Israel is, it's possible, it's likely, it's probable that she would see the issue very, very differently. And this is the point that we're going to harp on tonight. This is the change of perspective that we all need to have to see this conversation differently. Jewish education is the key to changing the conversation around Jews who are anti-Israel. Phyllis Bennis understood what it means to be a Jew through a very, very narrow lens. In Phyllis Bennis's understanding of what it means to be a Jew, this is what it means to be a Jew. It's fair to assume that if Phyllis Bennis would have had the opportunity to have received a more thorough and robust Jewish education, this is what Phyllis Bennis would understand is important about being a Jew. When we speak about anti-Israel sentiments, anti-Semitism that is rampant among young Jews, it is this point that we need to drill home on. The need to provide them with a robust Jewish education, a general Jewish education. And here I would make the point that we're not specifically speaking about giving them an education about the land of Israel or the state of Israel or Israeli history, a general Jewish education. We know this to be true. We know the connection, the profound connection between general Jewish education and how that pertains to the land of Israel from a very, very interesting piece of Torah. The Torah begins with the verse, Bereshis bara Elokim eis hashamayim ve'es haaretz. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. There's a Rashi, there's a piece of commentary on the first verse of the Torah. And Rashi is puzzled by a fundamental question. Ilana, read for us text 6 on page 95. Please.
Rabbi Yitzchak stated, the Torah should have begun with the first mitzvah commanded to the Jews, which is contained in the verse, this month shall be to you, Exodus. For what purpose does it start with, in the beginning God created the earth? The solution is found in the verse. It recounted the strength of his word, of his words to his people, to give them the inheritance of the nation. In other words, if the nation of the world accused the Jews with the claim, you are thieves for having conquered the lands of the seven nations, the Jews should reply, the entire world is God's. He created it and granted it to whomever it desired. It was his will to initially give it to the seven nations, and it was his will to subsequently remove it from them and give it to us.
Rashi the Medrash should say, is bothered by a question. The Torah is a book of instruction. It's a book of laws. It's a book of teaching. The Torah is not a book of fairy tales. Where does the Torah start? With fairy tales. If you open up a Chumash, if you open up a Bible, you won't find an instruction given to the Jewish people for 1.5 books. That's why we have a Torah? Teach us fairy tales? No, the Torah should have started and God said to Moses, the Jewish people should do this and shouldn't do that. We start with fairy tales, or with biblical tales. Why do we start with stories? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak said the reason why God began the Torah with the verse that says that it was the Almighty God that created heaven and earth was specifically for this purpose. There would come a day, says the Medrash. There would come a day when the nations of the world would turn to the Jewish people and say, you are thieves. You have no right to this land. To which the Jewish people will say, what? God Almighty created heaven and earth. And God decided to give the land to the seven nations, and then he decided to give it to us. Why do the Jewish people have a right to what we now know as the state of Israel or the land of Israel? Why do the Jewish people have a right to Israel? Why does Israel have a right to exist? Not because of Balfour and history and Jewish survival and leagues of nations and United Nations. It's for one reason. And that reason can be found in text 7 on page 97, 2 verses in Genesis chapter 13. God told Abraham, raise your eyes and look around from where you are to the north and the south, to the east and the west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. Why do the Jewish people have a right to Israel? Because God said so. If you have a problem, you are welcome to take it up with him during office hours, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. He's available by hard mail, by email, and on social media. But it is the Almighty God who gave the Jewish people the rights to the land of Israel. And this verse, Genesis chapter 13, was said to the Jewish people over and over and over again. First to Abraham, then to Isaac, then to Jacob, then to Moses, then to Joshua, reiterated to the Jewish people throughout their generations. Yes, Antonino?
Why can't the world share this perspective?
That's a wonderful question. I struggle to figure out the answer to that question daily. I struggle to figure out the answer to that question daily. But here's what I can tell you, and here's where we can make a difference. Why the world can't figure out this perspective, I don't know. But Jews can begin to understand this perspective. One second. By giving Jewish people the ability to understand on a basic level the fundamentals of Jewish education, namely Torah and God, are exciting, relevant, and meaningful. You know what the real problem is? If I were to have a bunch of fifth graders, Jewish kids from this community, from any community, it's not Salt Lake City's from any community, and I sit them down and I say, kids, you know why the Jewish people have a right to Israel? Because that's what God said to the Jewish people in the Torah. Rabbi, with all due deference, God doesn't mean much to us. Torah doesn't mean much to us. You're not making very convincing points. And that's where this battle is being lost. That's where this battle is being lost. If Jewish children would have the attitude of, oh, that's what it says in the Torah? That's the word of God? Okay, I see this issue from an entirely new lens. The foundation of this conversation is that Torah and God are exciting, relevant, and meaningful. If we can get to that, what do we build on top of that? Well, then, one of the areas of Jewish education that is exciting, relevant, and meaningful is the idea of Israel education from a Torah lens. When we get to that, we can hope in the long term, perhaps in the very long term, to minimize the amount of anti-Israel activity amongst Jewish people. Now, Antonino's point, if I were to make this argument to a room full of non-Jews, would it hold a lot of water? Lav dafka, as they say. Not necessarily. If I were to go to the BDS conference and say, ladies and gentlemen, I want to make a compelling argument to you. You know why the Jewish people have a right to the land of Israel? Because God told this to Abraham that would tell me to take my God and my Abraham and stick him where the sun don't shine. I can't argue. But if we can provide Jewish people with the opportunity to see this issue differently, we might have very different results on this. Yes, Lord.
Well, the comment I was going to make is these other religions are based on our Torah, right? Christians, Mormons, whoever, right? They believe in the Bible. They believe in both what they call like the Old Testament and the New Testament. So why don't they believe that? I mean, if they believe in the Bible, that's what I don't understand.
I think you're asking the wrong guy. But yes, your comment is well taken. I agree with you. Antonino, you had something else before that I deferred. Go ahead.
The world looks at it as, yeah, you can say, okay, God told you this last night. That's subjective. The world needs an objective opinion. Why didn't Hashem also inform the world community?
Okay.
This is the way the real estate.
Good question. Good question. We're going to hopefully get to that point by the end of class tonight. At the end of the day, and this is, kind of a fundamental question as to, why does God allow for there to be so much confusion in the world? And that is, God wants to exist in a space where human beings have the opportunity to fly in the face of what he says. It's kind of the system that he had envisioned. So God could, if this were really God's opinion, God has the ability to come down hard and say, guys, this is what I think. And let me make this abundantly clear to you in a way that won't really leave space for any argument. At the end of the day, it's God's decision not to function in that way, to indeed create an ecosystem where people can go astray and by their own beliefs. But if we believe the Torah to be the representation of his word, that is what his word is. Let's read for a sec text 8. Text 8 is a letter that the Rebbe wrote, I believe in the 1960s. The Rebbe wrote it to the former president of Israel, Mr. Zalman Shazar. And the Rebbe speaks about this specific issue of bringing God into the Israel conversation. Says the Rebbe, I have received complaints. Why do I invoke the biblical land of Israel, the Holy Land, and the covenant with Abraham in connection with modern Israel? Why do I mix God into the picture? After all, they say those who fought for the creation of the state, those who led it, those who currently direct it, and its authorized representatives, they all proclaim and take pains to emphasize that Israel is a state founded in 1948. To the Rebbe's point, and we've been speaking a lot about why don't the non-Jews believe this. If I walked into the Knesset tomorrow morning, and I said, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished members of the Knesset, you're here to represent the interests of the citizens of Israel. Why? Why Israel? You know, they would all give me a history lesson. And they would all talk about Balfours and United Nations and Leagues of Nations and all that things that are jolly well. So the point that Rebbe is dealing with is if the leaders of the land themselves subscribe to these mentalities, why are we mixing in our own rationales? My answer, put frankly, is that their narrative is false. No new entity was created in 1948. Rather, that was the year in which a large part of the land of Israel was liberated. An entity established in 1948, based on the agreement or authorization of the nations of the world, has no strength or justification in terms of an authentic response to the claim, you are thieves for having conquered lands belonging to others, a claim raised by the Arabs, the Vatican, the United Nations, and some Jews as well. This is why it is so crucial to underscore that it is our God-given home. Now, I do not delude myself into imagining that these just and honest arguments will prevail in the United Nations, the Vatican, and etc. Nevertheless, says the Rebbe, transmitting this truth is critical for the morale of Jewish youth living in the Holy Land, including those serving in the IDF, for Jewish American students, and for the Jewish youth of other countries as well. And the Rebbe makes a profound point. We are never going to change the mind of the United Nations. Right? As Jews, we have lived in sad and unfortunate realities throughout our history. And as Jews living in the 21st century, having this pain in our backsides called the United Nations, it is what it is, my friends. I've got no good news on that front. They're not going to change their perspectives anytime soon. But the point that Rebbe makes is that's not the battle we need to win. We're not here to change the minds of the UN or the Vatican at all. We're here to boost the morale of the soldiers in the IDF. We're here to raise the spirits of Jewish youth in Israel, on college campuses, here in the United States. That's who we're fighting for. Sadly, we see across this nation, especially on college campuses, anti-Israel sentiment is rampant. And Rabbi, what are we going to do about it? Not a whole lot. Not a whole lot. I can't fight against the existence of Students for Justice for Palestine. Just like I couldn't fight against Hanukkah and Antiochus and Haman and the story of Purim, I can't fight against anti-Semitism. What can I do? Rather, what must I do? Make sure that the Jewish kid, the Jewish undergrad at the University of Utah, when he sets foot on campus and is approached by a student from Students for Justice for Palestine, that when a brochure is placed in his hands, he will have a clear perspective on that. I can't stop the brochure being placed in his hands. I can't stop that brochure from being printed. I can't change the minds of the people who put that brochure together. For the Jewish kids that will one day pick up that brochure and begin to have second thoughts about being a proud Jew, boom, that's our fight. That's our battle. Jewish education as a whole, explaining to our youth the importance of remembering that Torah and God are exciting, relevant, and meaningful, and everything else is really going on. I'm going to pause for a brief moment for questions. We're 5 minutes behind schedule. I do want to end off with the last point of the class. Any questions? My friends on Zoom, are we good? iPhone Rick? I can't tell if you're smiling or frowning. I got a nod from Rick. Okay. So, I smiled. Good. Okay.
Questions.
Yes.
4-point clarification that ties into why is this?
What is it?
So in one of the translations, the Torah, Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, somewhere this idea of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, 2 sons,
Yes.
Ishmael,
Yes.
and
Isaac.
Isaac. Somewhere in one of these translations, somewhere, somehow, in some way, the notion comes forward, I won't call it a notion, but the opinion is, or the reading is, that the land belongs to both.
Good for them.
Arabs and Jews. The question was brought out, how can they view these things when it's so clearly given by God to the Jews? They say, and.
Okay. Again, I can't fight that.
But I don't know, is there?
We live in a world, Doug, where people have a belief
Right.
and then say to themselves, oh gosh, this is my belief. I wonder how I can justify my belief. Let me go search for a text that justifies my belief. Well, here are 8 texts. 7 of them don't justify your belief. Those don't exist. Oh, there's one that does, that's the one. So you want to look for something which justifies a position that you've already taken? God bless you. I've got nothing to say to you. We're not having a conversation at that point. You want to know what the book says? That's what the book says. You want to go ahead and adapt the translation of that book to fit your aims? Like I said, good for you. But not much I can do in that regard. Okay? In text 6, we talked about this question. Yes, the Torah is concerned that the nations of the world are going to come to the Jewish people and say, you've stolen the land of Israel. I got a question. How many questions do the nations of the world have against the Jewish people? Thousands. Since when does the Torah take one seriously? The Torah is going to alter the entire state of affairs for one reason: to accommodate a question, which is not so much of a question as much as it's a complaint from the nations of the world. No, the nations of the world have a problem with the Jewish people. Take a number. No, says Rashi, we altered the whole book to answer the questions of the nations of the world. Why are we so bothered by this question? Along comes Jewish mysticism and explains there's something very, very profound involved in this dialogue, involved in this question, why should the Jews claim ownership of this land? See, on the surface, that's the question. Why are the Jews in Israel? Why can't they go to Yugal? Explain Jewish mysticism that laying beneath the surface is something far more profound. Instead of looking at the question, why should the Jews claim ownership of this land? Why should the Jews claim ownership of this physical land if Jewish identity is rooted in the Torah's spiritual practices? If we're talking about the idea that the basis for the Jewish people having a homeland is God promising something to the Jewish people, a spiritual entity, why does a spiritual entity need a home, need a physical home, need a physical land to tie it down to? Let's read text 10 and 11 quickly together. Page 102. An objective, unprejudiced survey of the long history of our people will at once bring to light the reality that our survival as a nation was not the result of material wealth or physical strength. Even during the most prosperous times under the united monarchy of King Solomon, the Jewish people, as well as its country, were materially insignificant by comparison with the contemporary world empires such as Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia. Nor was it our active statehood or the control of our geographic homeland that secured our existence, as is evidenced from the reality that for the vast majority of our history, our people have lived in exile, without a kingdom, and without a home. Similarly, our Hebrew language did not play a vital role in our perpetuation, for even in biblical times, Aramaic supplanted the Holy Tongue as the spoken language to the extent that parts of the scripture, almost all of our Babylonian Talmud, the Zohar, and other key works were composed in Aramaic instead of Hebrew. Later in the times of Reb Saadia Gaon and Maimonides, most of the Jewish masses spoke Arabic, and further down the line it was Yiddish and other languages. It is also impossible to ascribe any common secular culture or contemporary scientific knowledge as a major preservation factor for our people, since such matters morphed radically from one era to another. The only remaining consideration, which is the sole factor that has remained consistent throughout the ages in all lands and under the fullest diversity of circumstance, is the Torah and mitzvot that the Jewish people, that the Jews have observed in their daily life with great self-sacrifice. So why do we need a land? The Jewish people have survived in a myriad of nations, speaking a myriad of languages, doing a myriad of things. Why do the Jewish people need square footage? Why do they need something earthbound to tie them down? Let's continue with text 11. The response to this is that the relationship between the Jewish people and the land of Israel is unique. It is not comparable to the relationship between any other nation and its homeland. Rather, the Jewish land is an integral part of the Jewish people's spiritual mission. The ultimate goal of the Jewish people's divine service is to turn this tangible world into a home for godly revelation, to the point that God's holiness dwells specifically in the physical reality of this world. For this reason, the majority of the Torah's commandments involve physical activities, so that the fulfillment of Torah and mitzvot installs sanctity into tangible materials. It was therefore critical to provide the Jews with the land of Israel a physical land, and to provide them with an abundance of mitzvot that can be performed exclusively within this land. For this expresses the entire goal within, I lost my spot. This expresses the entire goal of the Jewish people and the purpose of the Torah, to conquer the physical dimension of the world and to transform it into a home for God. Last week, we talked about the fact that there's something spiritual behind anti-Semitism. There's a void that the Haman anti-Semite, the mound anti-Semite suffers from, which is what leads him to his actions. Explains Jewish mysticism. There's a similar root cause to anti-Israel sentiment. What is the problem of the anti-Semite? The problem of the anti-Semite is I don't understand what your people's problem is. You're a spiritual people. You're a people that have lived with spiritual ideals that have transcended time and space and land and language and tyranny after tyranny. Why do you need a physical land to live a spiritual life? Sure.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs is very fundamental.
Okay.
It's psychological need for all of us.
For a space.
A safe place.
Right. So the counter argument to that is that we've gone for generations without.
Yeah.
We have a space here in Salt Lake City.
But you're searching for your ancestral space.
Oh, and Jewish mysticism will tell you that that need for a space is rooted in something very powerful. I'm not disagreeing with you. Why does the soul have that need for a space? Explains Jewish mysticism. Because what the land of Israel represents is the harmony of divine service, is the goal of divine service. That a physical world and godly revelation should come into one. Why does the Jew yearn for a homeland? Because a Jew is a soul. And a Jew realizes that it's the purpose of his soul, the very existence of his soul, is to realize the entire goal of creation, which is to create a dwelling place for God in a physical abode. God doesn't only want to live in the spiritual realms. God wants us to create a very, physical, corporeal existence for him in the most mundane of realities. God wants to be worshipped in a land. God wants to be worshipped in a physical sense. God doesn't want us just to feel Judaism. God wants us to live a tangible and practical Judaism with observances that take up the land. Build synagogues, build Jewish homes, fill them with Jewish belongings, serve God here on earth, here in this land, in this world. I'll take a question in a second. This is a reality which I think doesn't only manifest itself in the land of Israel, but that's the basis for our conversation today. I want to share a kind of a pertinent story. It's always this time of year that I get into this issue with Jews here in town. And so is true with my colleagues around the country. Hanukkah is coming. And as anyone knows who's been associated with Chabad, Chabad has this burning desire to make these public menorah lightings in as many places as possible. And there are Jews whom it drives crazy. There are Jews to whom it's obscene to them. And I'll never forget, one of the things we're very excited to do this year, and this conversation literally happened today. So from the day my father got to town, 1992, Chabad began putting up public menorah. First it was at Foothill Village, and then it was at the Gallivan Center downtown, and so on and so forth. And our activities have grown. The governor would come to a menorah lighting every year. That became a big spectacle, and it was in the capital. In 2015, we started lighting the menorah at the Jazz Game. If it ever works out that there's a home game during Hanukkah, we light a menorah at the arena. When do we light a menorah at the arena? And thank God our ability to do this event has grown and metastasized from year to year. When do we light the menorah at the arena? When and where? At halftime. At halftime, right on the lower concourse, when they redecorated the arena, there was a perfect spot for it, and it's shown on every screen. Every single year. I go to Jews in town. They should come to the event. Maybe they want to sponsor the event. You know, it's a great marketing opportunity. And I go to Jews in town and I say, hey, Bob, I want to tell you something. Yeah, Rabbi, what's going on? Hanukkah, we're doing a menorah lighting. That's great, Rabbi. That's great. Good for you. Light your menorah. You with your family and your kids light the menorah. That's beautiful. No, Bob, no. You know where we're lighting the menorah this year? At Vivint Arena. Oi, Rabbi, you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that, Rabbi. It's better you light the menorah at home with your kids. No, Bob! I'm lighting the menorah in Vivint Arena. You know when I'm lighting the menorah, Bob? At halftime. When the arena is buzzing and it's going to be shown on every screen in the building, 18,306 people are going to see the menorah being lit at halftime. Oi, Rabbi, why can't you light the menorah in the synagogue? Why can't you light the menorah at home with you and your loved ones? Because for so many people, Judaism should be a spiritual pursuit. The rabbi should light the menorah in the synagogue. He'll gather around a few other nut jobs. They'll light the menorah together, and we'll leave Judaism to the kooks. We'll leave Judaism to the crazy people, and the menorah will be lit by the rabbi Shashtil in the corner of the synagogue. No one should know. And what do we say to that? That's not the world that God wanted. God didn't want the menorah to be lit in our hearts. And God didn't only want the menorah to be lit in the corner of the synagogue. And God didn't even want the menorah to be lit in the rabbi's home, that his neighbors who live on the rabbi's side street should see it. God wanted a menorah lit in the most visible fashion, in the most corporeal fashion, in the most physical fashion. Downtown Salt Lake City, in the middle of the game, at halftime on the big screen. That's the world that God wanted. God didn't want the Jews to be spiritual Jews, live a spiritual life in your closet somewhere in Brooklyn, Shashtil, no one should know about it. God wanted the Jewish people to have a land, have an earthly relationship with God, because ultimately that is the goal of our divine service, is to create a physical dwelling place for God in this world. Ilana, what was your question?
Yes. Does it not follow from what you just said that if really the previous text is making the argument that a lot of the laws that are in the Torah are just really geared to Israel. So you can only make those
when we have a homeland.
When you are in Israel,
correct.
Not just when
correct.
Isn't it also an argument for rebuilding the temple?
Yes, when God decides it's time. There are 613 commandments in the Torah. Over 200 are inapplicable in today's day and age.
That's right.
Because there's no holy temple. And so
but why waiting for that?
Because it's God's holy temple. It's God's home. We build the holy temple when God instructs us to. It's God who took it down, and it will be God who will decide when it needs to go back up. It's not our place to make the decision for him. I see a comment from our friend Laura. Oh, Laura had to bounce. Okay, let's wrap it up with tonight's. Uh-oh. There we go. Any minute now.
Lesson 3, the promised land. 1. Anti-Semitism seeks legitimacy from the most prestigious authority of any given era. At present, this authority is the pursuit of human rights. Consequently, many of today's anti-Semites focus overwhelmingly on Israel and accuse it of being the ultimate violator of human rights. 2. When Israel is A, demonized, or B, judged with a double standard, or C, when Israel's existence is delegitimized, that challenge exposes itself as an expression of anti-Semitism. 3. When anti-Semites refrain from asserting that they seek to annihilate Jewry, but merely take issue with specific Jewish beliefs and practices, claiming them to be barbaric, Jews can be tempted to join the fight against their fellow Jews, believing that they are saving Jews rather than hurting them. 4. There are several arguments for why Jews need and have a right to Israel. Most crucial is the Torah's oft-reiterated reminder that God gave Jews the land of Israel as an eternal inheritance. The deeper our appreciation of this reality, the more we educate the next generation about its implications, the more support we will nourish toward the land of Israel. Such an approach can desirably influence the wider audience, but the most vital audience is our Jewish brothers and sisters. 5. To support Torah and God-based reason, it is necessary to create an environment that cherishes the Torah and nurtures faith. It is therefore critical to provide a robust Jewish education to ourselves and to the next generation. 6. Jews are a nation not because of our land, but because of our Torah. Nevertheless, the land is important to the Torah's vision of the world, inasmuch as it embodies the Jewish mission on earth, to infuse physicality with holiness.
Next week, Monday, November 15th, lesson 4, the last lesson of this course entitled Change of Heart. We've been having a lot of hypothetical conversations. Anti-Semitism, it's real, it's bad, it's here, it's not going away. What do we do? Practically, we bump up against it. Next week, we're going to be having some case studies, different episodes in our past where the Jewish communities around the world had to deal with real, practical anti-Semitic issues. What do we do and how do we handle it? I hope you'll join me here in person next Monday night at 7:30. The email will go out tomorrow with the recap and the video recording of tonight's class. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you'll buy tickets to come and join us for Jewish Heritage Night with the Utah Jazz on Monday, 3 weeks from tonight, Monday, November 29th. At the Vivint Arena, we'll be lighting the menorah in front of 18,306 people. I very much hope you'll be able to join. It's a beautiful night in the community. I hope we'll see you there. And at the very least, I hope to see you next Monday night. Have a delightful, delightful evening.